Okay, we're going to go into the second video and we'll continue this discussion on freedom, the voluntary, the chosen. Now, last time video I was articulating Aristotle and Aquinas' ideas on what is voluntary, what is chosen, how we deliberate, etc. Today, in this lecture, I want to talk a little bit about what I'm going to call an existential overview of some of these ideas. What does existential mean here? Well, it just pertains to the existentialist school of philosophy or school of thought. Guys like Soren Kierkegaard, Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, Martin Heidegger, etc., placed a great deal of emphasis on our human freedom, our ability to make ourselves into certain sorts of people, and how that capacity was essential to our being who we are and to our human happiness and flourishing. All right. The first thing I kind of want to get into as we talk about this is the fact that external circumstances are not determinative of our freedom. They don't overwhelm our freedom. They don't compel every facet, every part of who we are. They don't totally force us to be a certain way. They can't ever completely destroy that spark of freedom that I was talking about last time. Now, when I think about that fact, I think about somebody like Viktor Frankl. And if you're not familiar with Frankl, let me just explain a little bit about him. Frankl was a Jewish doctor living in Vienna, Austria in the 1930s, who, along with his family, was rounded up by the Nazis during the Holocaust. And he himself was sent to various concentration camps and eventually ended up at Auschwitz. Frankel, unlike pretty much everybody else in his family, actually survived the war. And out of that experience came to a new understanding of psychology. He formulated a theory called logotherapy, which was the idea that essentially human beings need to find and follow deep meaning in their lives. And he presented the tenets of this in an absolutely wonderful book called Man's Search for Meaning. Frankl was also a leading practitioner in what has become known as existential psychology. Now, Frankl is important to this discussion for a lot of reasons, but I'm going to hone in on a couple here. Frankl talks about being in these concentration camps in Auschwitz, and the circumstances there are absolutely horrendous. He would have been a well-known and well-respected psychiatrist and doctor in Vienna, high society in Vienna, and now he's put in this concentration camp. And the first thing, of course, is that there's the awareness of how many people are dying in the gas chambers. He recognizes that he's cut off. He's cut off from his family. He doesn't know where they are. He doesn't even know if they're alive. So he's very alone and desolate in the world now. He doesn't have any freedom of movement. He's within this very small confined area. He's forced to get up and do really ridiculous menial tasks. The Nazis would bring them out and have them dig trenches in the middle of winter for no apparent reason. He's seeing people around him get desperate and die all the time. He's malnourished. He's underfed. The food that is fed them is horrible. The guards mistreat them. They call them horrible names. They're degrade them. They want to destroy their sense of humanity. They think of them kind of as animals. Some of the Jewish prisoners become what are called capos, and they collaborate with the Nazis. So there's this breaking of that heritage that he had known. He's dressed like everybody else. He has these tattoos put on his arm to indicate his number because he's more now of a number rather than a person. He has no ability really to practice his medicine or his doctoral art, his art as a doctor, his skill as a doctor to a great deal. It's just awful set of circumstances. People are dying in horrible ways every day. He's cold constantly. He's hungry. He's sick. Doesn't seem to be any escape. It seems hopeless. All of that is going on all around him all the time. There's no escape from that. That's the external reality that he has to confront every day, and it's horrible. And many people, says Frankel, just chose to give up. They ran into the electrical fence, or they ran into the fences. They would try to escape just so that they could get shot and end their misery. It was just unfathomably bad and horrific circumstances that I don't think most of us can really get a sense of. We can talk about it, but we don't really understand the depth of despair and horror that would confront you in that kind of situation. But Frankel kind of says something fascinating. He says that in this kind of horrible set of circumstances, it was never the case that he completely lost his freedom. He said the Nazis couldn't take that away. They could not take away from him, for example, the ability to control his own thoughts. Now, he illuminates this with a very beautiful and touching story, or not story, it's an example from his time there, about one day he's out digging these trenches that are done for no apparent reason. So it's meaningless, menial, and totally degrading work. He's cold, he's hungry, he's practically starving to death. He's being treated like a dog. He can't escape. He has guns pointed at him. He's being cursed at. In the midst of all those circumstances, he said he was able to think about his wife, whom he didn't even know if she was still alive. He was able to think about her in a very loving way and reflect on the intensity of the love that they had shared and the beauty of their relationship, and know that in some way he could connect to her on a spiritual level, and that nothing the Nazis did could take away that ability he had to have that memory of his wife, to have that reflection on his wife, to have that wish for her to be well, and to contemplate the love they shared. All of that kind of mental, spiritual activity was something that could not be controlled by the Nazis. They could take away everything else, all the externals could be stripped away, but that inner freedom remained strong and vibrant in him. And he just paints this, like I said, very moving and heartfelt picture of what he was able to experience in his mind, contemplating his wife and how deep and real that was for him. And nothing could take that away. So, in these circumstances, we see that freedom is an inner job. It's not an outer job. And that's a little bit difficult, I think, for us to kind of get a good handle on in today's world, because I think we see freedom as, well, the ability to move about from one place to another, the ability to change from one job to the other, the ability to have a new car, the ability to have a different sort of TV, the ability to change relationships, blah 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 blah. Well, I shouldn't say blah 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 blah. All those are Some of those are fairly important exercises of freedom. But what Frankel shows is that they're not the primary one. The primary, the foundational, the basic, perhaps most important one is our ability to choose what we think about, what our attitude is like, where our mental energy is spent, what we focus on, how we see ourselves, how we see the world around us. All of that is a freedom stemming from within that we can employ in our interaction with the world, no matter the circumstances. Now, it's limited. It's not as if we can just magically have a Pollyanna happy face about everything. We can't just transcend the circumstances by any means necessary. But that freedom is afforded us even in horrible and difficult circumstances. Now, another example that I think relevant here is the example of Nelson Mandela. Mandela was imprisoned in the late 1960s in South Africa for protesting apartheid. And he was imprisoned on Robben Island for almost 25 years. And horrible, he had to work in a quarry mining stones. It hurt his eyesight. There was a horrible amount of racism exercised toward him. He was living in a cell that was like 6 feet by 6 feet. It was tiny. He had no provision. I mean, it was just awful. And Mandela realized a number of things in the course of this, that he still had some degree of freedom. He could choose not to be angry with or resent his captors and the racist system that was at play in South Africa, the apartheid. He could choose not to feel anger toward them. And eventually he got to the point where he could even choose to forgive them. And it wasn't because of the circumstances. The circumstances were still very, very heinous. They were still very horrible. But he had that ability within himself to actually make certain choices. Now, there was a movie made about 7 or 8 years ago about Nelson Mandela. It's called Invictus. And you might ask, well, why is it called Invictus? Well, it's called Invictus because Invictus is the name of a poem written in the 1850s by, can't remember the man's name, but a man who suffered with lifelong, very difficult, debilitating illness. And he writes this poem basically describing that his life circumstances, even though they're quite, quite horrible, cannot destroy his freedom, cannot destroy his will to live, cannot destroy his ability to choose his attitude and how he approaches his life. The poem ends with a very, very beautiful line. 2 lines. It says, I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. And the captain of my soul. I think we should pause and reflect on that for a second. What does a captain do? Well, a captain's in charge of a ship. And the captain decides which direction the ship is going to go. It decides what speed the ship is going to have, decides how much fuel will be used, how many of the sails will go up on the ship, who will be steering the ship, what everybody will be doing. He gives orders. He expects them to be followed out. He takes responsibility for what happens. He takes the blame if it goes well. He gets praised if it goes. He takes the blame if it goes poorly. He gets praised if it goes well. He makes sure there are adequate provisions. Kind of keeps everything working in good order, etc. Captain of my soul being, as we talked about in the first week, this inner principle of life that directs me in certain ways. It moves us in certain ways. It has these faculties of the rational, the nutritive, and the appetitive faculties. The captain of the soul is somebody who gets to decide how those faculties are at work. He gets to decide how those faculties are at work, sometimes no matter the circumstance. That's, I think, the key point here, no matter the circumstance. So even if there's a horrible storm, and even if the ship is in a lot of difficulty, like we talked about in the last video, what can the captain do? Well, the captain can say, we have to survive, and I'm ordering you to take the cargo, throw it overboard. And he's decisive and he's strong in that, and he makes the order, it's carried out, and they all survive. So the captain takes responsibility, and he realizes that even in this set of circumstances that are very difficult and very trying, like a huge storm at sea that could sink the ship and destroy everybody on board, he still has something left he can try, which is to throw the cargo overboard. And he assumes control, and he does it. In a similar way, with the Poem Invictus, what Mandela, what Frankel are pointing out is the fact that the circumstances in life may limit what we can do and limit that very, very severely, but they can't take away our capacity to, in some sense, direct our souls, direct, for example, our rational faculty, what we think about, and how we assume a certain attitude towards things, and how we might even feel sometimes about things. And it's not, again, I want to emphasize, this is not like the ability to put the blinders on and say, no matter what happens, I feel great. No, it's not a blind situation. It's not a situation of negate, imagining yourself in a different circumstances. Let me explain that a little bit more. Frankel talks about how even in prison, he was able to find things to be grateful for. Let me pause to say it again. Even in prison, he was able to find things for which he could be grateful. And sometimes it might be the fact that he had an extra loaf of very small stale bread. Now, I've never felt gratitude for eating stale bread. I'm angry about it, been upset about it, but I've never felt gratitude. What that tells me is that Frankel had assumed a much higher level of awareness and self direction, that captaincy of his soul. He realized that that was actually something he could be grateful for because it meant he felt a little less hungry and it was a little bit healthier for him. And it was a little better. He was a little bit better off. And no matter what, he had that sense of gratitude that, and he could really feel that. And that didn't negate any of the horrible and horrific context that he was in or how problematic, difficult those circumstances were. But what it did mean is that he could still choose an attitude of gratefulness even within that context. A second example that comes to mind is a Benedictine monk. His name was Father Placid. He was from Hungary, and I actually had the honor of meeting him a couple of years before he died. So in the 1950s, Father Placid was a Benedictine monk in Hungary, and he got arrested by the Soviets and placed in a gulag. And in the course of this, he and his fellow prisoners came up with certain rules for life. A monk has his own rule, right? The rule of Benedict or the rule of Dominic. So they knew they had to have a rule for life that helped them get through these circumstances, help them survive, help them to continue to have hope. And one of the things that they did was that they said each and every day, each person would be asked to try to find something for which he was grateful. Now, it's a gulag. It's Siberia. It's freaking cold. Soviets hate them. They're not able to say the sacraments. They're not able to say mass. They're not in their role as priests. They're being misfed, mistreated. Very similar to those situations at Auschwitz. Perhaps not quite as bad, but still pretty bad. How could they find something to be grateful for every day? It takes work, right? That takes effort, that takes awareness. And it could be something small, maybe the sound of a bird chirping, maybe the beauty of a leaf falling, maybe the sunset, maybe the fact that somebody smiled, maybe the fact that somebody said their name, maybe the fact there was a real human connection. But what it meant is that they chose to really have a deep contemplative awareness of that stuff, not just pass it by, not just have it be a surface level thing like we often do in life, where you don't have any recognition of the deep significance and meaning that obtains in these sorts of things. There's beauty to be found all around us, but we just kind of, I think, often skim over it, and that's what happens. You know, you're living your life, and you don't take the time to really pause and let those beautiful or wonderful things actually move you to gratitude. But I think what we're seeing with guys like Frankel, with Mandela, with Father Placid, is that they recognized these things, again, like I said last time, have a very deep, almost life or death significance. If they were going to survive in these circumstances, it wasn't because they were well fed. It wasn't because they were fat, dumb, and happy. It wasn't because things were going well and they could kind of skate along. All that was gone. What did they have? They had what was within them. What was within them was to be able to see that there were still things to be grateful for, even in that kind of circumstance. So the choices were not eradicated. They could still choose gratitude. They could choose kindness. Frankel talks about how he was got to the point where he recognized and said to himself, I'm a doctor. I have a degree in psychiatry. And yeah, I'm being treated like an animal by the Nazis, and they degrade me, and they say that, your degree is worthless here and all that. He says, maybe I can try to treat some of my fellow prisoners who are sick and try to make them feel better a little bit. Maybe I can offer them some counsel or advice based on my knowledge of psychiatry and psychology. I am an agent here. He's basically saying, I can choose to do this. I'm not determined by what other people by being in prison in Auschwitz. And it's a paradox because you think, okay, freedom is gone. And he says, no, my freedom comes from here. My freedom is not gone. It's it's limited. It's attenuated. But insofar as I can act from within the freedom that is within me, I can actually kind of make a difference in these kind of situations. I think that's something I want to touch on a little bit more, is this idea of making a difference. Now, it's a phrase that can often get misused and misapplied. Somebody says, "Well, just make a difference." Well, that's a vague statement. I don't just stated as such, go and make a difference, doesn't necessarily imply a lot, doesn't really tell us much, doesn't give us good guidance. So on the one hand, we see a statement like making a difference, and we think, well, it could be trite or a platitude and doesn't really have a lot of weight. But on the other hand, I think when we understand it within the context of our lives, it does have a lot of weight and it does have significance, and it's not just a trite or platitudinous kind of statement. Now, I'm going to get into this discussion by talking about Star Trek Generations, because I love the movie and I think it clarifies kind of what I'm getting at. Now, in the movie, um, the Next Generation crew is up against a very determined foe named Sauron, and he's basically about to kill millions of people and the crew of the whole Enterprise. And Picard happens upon Captain James Tiberius Kirk, the captain of the first Enterprise. And he realizes that Kirk is basically the only person who can help him in this situation. And at first, Kirk's kind of retired. He doesn't seem that interested, but eventually Picard begins talking to him about what it's like to be the captain of the Enterprise. And Kirk realizes that as the captain of the Enterprise, you can make a difference. And what does that mean in this situation? Well, it means that he can help Picard actually stop the bad guy and prevent these millions of people from dying and save the crew of the Enterprise. So at the very end, after Kirk has been injured, He asked Picard, "Did we make a difference?" Picard said, "Yes." Now, it's kind of a silly example, but what does it tell us? It tells us that making a difference relates to where we're at in life, what we're doing, what our position is, what our job is, the people around us, etc. It's context specific, in other words. It's not make a difference across the whole world. It's make a difference in your own corner of. Now, I had a professor at grad school who liked to talk about this as creasing your corner of the world. And you think about, like shirt or pants, you can crease them, you can kind of wrinkle them a little bit, you can reform them in a way. And I think a similar thing is going on here, that we can have a great deal of influence over certain situations, certain relationships, people in our lives, in the setting, the context, the situation that we are in right now, that we happen to find ourselves in. This term influencers is sort of a vogue term right now, right? That we talked about, the people who are social influencers. They influence everybody. Well, in one sense, they do. They perhaps influence things like fashion or ideas that we talk about or the political situation. It's fine, what happens, but that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about actually having an influence, making a difference, creasing your corner of the world. Now, let me get kind of down to brass tacks. Um, it would seem that President Trump or people in Congress, for example, are influencers. For example, they will influence, just as one example, um, welfare policies in the United States, so the amount of welfare and money that are available for people who are disabled or can't find work or situations like that. So on a kind of national political level, a fair amount of people may be struggling financially as a result of that. That has influenced their lives, right? Those sorts of decisions have duly and in a strong way influence their lives. But what about this? The fact is that I can also perhaps help that person find a job, or I can give that person some extra clothing or food or money. I can set that person up with somebody I know who helps people write resumes. I can donate him a used computer so he can look for work. I can do things for him that perhaps will make a difference. Now, it's one person, right? But there's a beautiful saying that was said at the end of the movie Schindler's List, said by, and it was, if you save one life, you save the world entire. I think one of the things that quotation means is that, well, saving the world is God's job, but maybe really making a difference in one other person's life is your job. Can't change the world. You can change the world for someone. Our understanding culturally today that I think is warped. We have this idea of like changing the culture, changing the world, saving the world, making the world a better place. They're noble aspirations, but I think they're misguided. Why are they misguided? They're misguided insofar as I think, they don't take into account what we talked about in the last video lecture. They're not taking into account the fact that, like, we are finite human beings. We can only work with finite number of options in the context of our lives, according to our knowledge, according to what we are able to do. That's what we are able to work with. That's where we're at. And that does not include anything like changing the world. So that has to be bracketed off and pushed aside and say, that's an impossible wish. That's a utopian total dream. It's not realizable. I can't do anything with that. So I'm going to push it aside. But what can I do? All that energy, all that sense of sympathy, that compassion, that recognition of issues, that desire to make a difference can be channeled and refined to make a difference in the circumstances, situations, context, relationships, and people in your life. I think it's important to kind of see this as like energy, you know, that we have a limited amount of energy in our lives. And imagine, let's put it this way. Imagine this water bottle is not filled with water, but it's an energy bottle, right? And it's a limited amount of it. Now, one thing that could happen is that I take a pen and I start, and and the pen would represent here my awareness of various problems in the world. And I take this pen and I recognize that there's a lot of poverty in the world. I recognize that there's a lot of injustice in the world. I recognize that there's a lot of racism in the world. I recognize there's a lot of hatred in the world, a lot of violence, a lot of social inequality, systematic issues, stuff like that. Eventually, I have poked so many holes in this, the energy's gone. It's seeped out. It's dissipated. And it's become so minute and small and insignificant as it dissipates that it doesn't do anything. But on the other hand, imagine that there's one person who can be at the end of this, and all that energy of compassion, kindness, desire to do good and make a difference gets focused on that one person. That's a hell of a lot of energy. That's a hell of a lot that you can bring to that situation. So, what we have here is this idea that increasing your corner of the world, making a difference, is fundamental to being human. But it's making a difference in and according to the context of your life, and doing that to the best of your ability. Jordan Peterson talks about this a fair amount. He calls it, making sure your own world is in order before you try to set the whole world in order. Making sure that you've made your own bed before you try to fix the world. And what does that mean? Well, it means make sure that your relationships with yourself and the people that you live with are in good shape. Make sure that you're doing a good job in your own life. Make sure that you're forming yourself well. Make sure you're living well here and now. That's what you have responsibility for. I'm not responsible for the state of the world, but I may be responsible for how well I exercise kindness to my friend. I may be responsible for how well I treat the people I live with. I am responsible for forming myself into a decent human being. I'm responsible for helping somebody whom I meet tomorrow. I'm responsible for doing my job well. I have those responsibilities. And yeah, I have to take that seriously. Responsibility, of course, being the flip side of freedom, right? We talked about this a little bit last time. I'll just expand on it some more. This ball, again, doesn't do anything, has no freedom. It's not responsible for what happens. The ball hits somebody. I'm responsible because I had the freedom to take the ball, throw it, and aim it at somebody, and then the person gets hit by the ball. So I'm responsible for that because the action followed from my free choice, my free deliberation. If I was pushed into somebody like that example I talked about last time of you slip and fall and accidentally hit somebody, that's not a free action on your part. You didn't deliberate about and choose that action. Therefore, you're not really responsible for it. So what we're seeing here is that with our freedom comes great responsibility. Quote another movie. I'll quote Spider-Man. With great power to exercise freedom. In other words, comes great responsibility. And the more we understand our freedom as being enacted in our corner of the world, the greater our sense of responsibility. It's only up it's only us who can live out this unique opportunity. It's only us who can bring this particular set of gifts to the world. It's only us who can make this kind of difference right here, right now, or over the course of our lives. No one else can. That's intimidating. That's a lot of responsibility. And I think I mean, I know I'm very often tempted to shirk from that and say, it's too much. What if I fail? What if I'm not good enough? What if I mess up? Geez, it's a burden. It's a weight. Um, Sartre talked about how we're kind of fated to choose, and it's a demand placed on us. And I think it's easy to shirk away from that by also directing our freedom to start thinking about the problems of the world in general rather than about the situations and problems of our own corner of the world, our own lives, our own contexts. And I think this is an easy situation to fall into, that we we can sort of shirk off the responsibility and just say, well, I can't do any better because that's the way the world is. There's huge climate change problems. We have an emotional 5-year-old in the White House. Um, Iran and the Middle East are a mess. The economy is difficult. And all those are true, but they don't negate our freedom, as we were seeing in the situations with Mandela, Frankel, Placid. And if they don't negate our freedom, they also don't negate our ability, because freedom and responsibility come together. So I think it's important, especially in today's world with social media, with the news, with Twitter, with all this stuff and Facebook and the proliferation of all this information, that we understand that our responsibility and our freedom are best exercised and really most fully exercised in the context of our lives. I'll get a little bit more personal on this. In the summer of 2005, I was living in Washington State. I was interning with the U.S. Forest Service, living in a cabin with no, not a cabin, a bunkhouse with 4 other people. There's no telephone there for a while. We didn't have any internet. We had no uh, cable TV. So I was very cut off from the news world. I didn't even know for a while who had won the NBA championship, which was rare for me not to know that. Um, but I still had opportunities to exercise freedom and responsibility. I had the opportunity to choose how I was going to relate to my coworkers. I had the opportunity to choose to try to get to know the people I lived with. I had the opportunity to choose to lend books to people I met because I thought they might be helpful for the person. I had the opportunity to offer some counsel and advice sometimes for people. I had the opportunity to really be very grateful for the incredible beauty of the place I was living in. I had the opportunity to study more about mindfulness and meditation and mysticism. I had the opportunity to make a difference, in other words. And did I make a great? I don't know. No. It wasn't a huge difference. It wasn't the end. It wasn't like didn't change the world. I know it impacted me. I think it impacted a couple of the people around me. It was a well spent 3 months. And I think what facilitated that in part was the fact that I was, quote unquote, cut off from the world. I didn't know what was going on. Well, that's just ridiculous. I did know what was going on. I knew what was going on every day in my life. I knew what was going on in some of the people around me. I knew what they were going through. So I knew what was going on in the most important and significant way. I knew what was going on in my life and the context that I was living in. So I, I think to understand freedom, it's best that we understand it again as properly harnessed and focused in the context of our life and not gripping, being spread and moved about in all these various ways that just perhaps misdirect it and misapply it and misappropriate it and end up kind of spilled out in 15 million directions rather than focused on one or two areas in which we can make a genuine difference and it really matters. Okay, now another thing I want to get at is something I'm borrowing from my friend Matt Stolte. Shout out to Matt for articulating this idea to me. Now, what is this idea? Well, this is the idea that what it has to do with what Aristotle calls the apparent good versus the real good. All right, so let's explain that for a second. So something that's really good is for Aristotle something like happiness, that activity of the soul in accordance with perfect virtue. The soul is working as it should. So that's the most ultimate final good that we're all all pursuing, and it's very good for anyone to do that, says Aristotle. Now, here's the thing: there are certain things that are always and everywhere good for people. We talked about health. We talked about a properly ordered soul. Um, Piety is another one of those things. Love is another one of those things. They're always and everywhere good, and we should pursue them, right? Here's the rub, though. Here's the issue. Each individual person has his or her own way of perceiving the world, right? The way I perceive the world is different from the way everybody else perceives it. We perceive the world based on our own past, our history, our likes and dislikes, our values, where we're at in life, etc. We can't help but do this. We each have our own interpretation of things. We each have our own ways of emphasizing certain things. The world shows up differently for me than it does for other people. Now, that what I mean by that is not so much that if I and another person are looking at a tree, for example, that I see a tree and he sees a walrus. No, we both see a tree, but perhaps the tree means something to me in a different way than it means to him. Perhaps I find it much more beautiful than he finds it. Perhaps he glances at it and moves on, and I really intend and contemplate the tree. I gaze at it intently. So the world shows up for each person a little bit differently. And we can't avoid that. It's inevitable. So following through with that, what we see is that some things appear good for some people and other things appear good for those people, for other people. Let's get more specific. Now, sitting outside for 4 hours seems really good to me. My friend Ryan Shea would probably concur with me on that. Sitting outside watching the sunset for 2 hours seems like a great thing to do. For other people, that seems horribly boring and not good and a waste of time almost. Now, the thing is, because of the fact that each person has his own perception of the world, his own way of thinking about the world, his own way of taking in the world. Um, each person has his own sense, in a way, of what appears good to him. Now, we can sometimes, let's go back to that example I said earlier, right? We were talking about the person who was intemperate and he was gaining weight and his life seemed out of control. And we could go up to him and say, "Come on, dude. Um, you're ruining your life. You need to get healthy." Why? Health is a good thing. We just said that. Health in general for everybody is a good thing. But here's the problem. It doesn't appear good for that person yet. It doesn't seem like a good thing to him. That's what we talked about. Now, trying to just tell this person, well, health is a good thing in general and you should do it, may not get him personally motivated to act. It may not move him. It may not speak to his heart. It may not really do much for him. So, talking in these more general, generic terms about what's good and what's not, it may mean the person agrees with you intellectually, but not from his heart or deep within his soul, because he has his own ways of seeing the world. And he has to take those into account based on where he's at in life and what he sees as good and not. So, in other words, when we're thinking about how we should counsel people about what might be good for their lives, or even perhaps even counseling ourselves, we always have to take into account the way that person kind of sees the world. We're not talking to a human being in general. We're talking to this unique, particular human being here and now with his own particular life story, his own particular way of experiencing the world, his own particular perception of the world. And you have to respond to that. You have to respect. Because if you just say, you have to do this because this is good for human beings to do, you don't respect the way that person is and the sort of things he has gone through and his own way of perceiving the world. So when we're talking with people about like inspiring them or helping them perhaps to see certain things as goods that they should pursue, or even telling ourselves that there's certain goods that we should pursue, we have to present it in such a way that it becomes desirable for the person or desirable for us, that it appears as something good for us. Not just that we recognize it kind of in a vague, general, generic sense, but that for us it means something good. It appeals to us in a particular way. It moves us in our unique way, according to where we're at in life, according to the way we perceive the world. So, for example, let's go back to the person who is intemperate and he has trouble recognizing that health is actually something good. Yeah. Eventually, there's kind of more general arguments. Well, come on, man. If you're healthy, you live longer. If you're healthy, like, um, just things work out better in general for people. All that general kind of argumentation or presentation doesn't work. And you eventually say, You care. You can tell the person maybe something like this would work. Look, there are a few people you genuinely care about, but the more unhealthy you get, the more it inhibits your ability to actually care, the more it works against your relationship with them. And insofar as you have love for them, maybe health is good for you. And maybe at that point, health can now appear as something good. Not just because there's been a general discussion about it, but because it seems good for the person then. He realizes this is something that's important for me to do because it means I'm better able to really exercise that care that I do feel deep down and I don't want to let go of. I remember seeing this a couple times with people who were addicted to drugs when I worked at a drug rehab clinic, that one of the things that would motivate them towards sobriety would be the knowledge that sobriety would allow them to better able to care for their kids. Sobriety is a good thing, right? It's easy to recognize that in general, but we're not talking about recognition of it in general as good. We're talking about it becoming something that somebody himself recognizes as good, something that really is becomes desirable for a particular person in his or her own life. It appears good for that person and motivates and inspires that person. That was done because the person recognized sobriety as something that would help him better live out some of the other things he wanted to do in his life or her life, such as care for his or her children. It wasn't sobriety in general that appeared good, that was this motivating factor. It was sobriety for the person in his attempt to care for his children and offer them a better example or something like that. Again, it wasn't just an intellectual consideration, it was more of a heartfelt. So all that is kind of to say that as we think about ways, uh, as we think about the human pursuit of what's good, we always have to respect the individual history, situation, and agency of each person in his or her own pursuit of that good. Because it's based on that individual history and agency that a person actually is motivated and inspired to pursue something good. When that's negated, when you're not taking that into account, that individual agency, that individual perception of the world, you can't really inspire and move people. You're not giving them the opportunity to exercise their freedom and agency well. You're not fostering that human ability in them. You're not guiding that ability to pursue something good for them in their life. And I realize this is kind of a complicated thing, but it's the difference between basically like almost a robotic pursuit of something that's good versus a human pursuit of something. So a robot can, you can program, you probably program a robot to, to clean a house. There's those tiny little robot things now that sense dirt and they go around and they vacuum it up, and that's a good thing, right? Just enter the program, it does the good thing. End of story. It senses the dirt and it wipes it up or it cleans it up. But that's not how human beings operate. A human being has to have a motivation to do something. He has to have a recognition that this is good for him. He has to feel that and sense that in a deep way. And he has to exercise his own agency. Again, he has to have a voluntary, chosen set of behaviors. It has to be a full human action. And a full human action falls upon his own recognition that this is something good for him, not a generic recognition that this is good in general and something that a robot can do. And I think this is something that kind of get lost sometimes in these discussions of morality and ethics, that we think it's just about, well, let's argue for what seems to be good for human nature, or something good for humans to do. And once that becomes clear, it's the end of the discussion. You should just go for it. You should pursue that. But again, humans are not like robots. We have to act based on where we're at in life, what's in our hearts, what we perceive, and what motivates us and inspires us. All right. So that kind of closes this second lecture for week 4. Again, this is kind of my own, as I said, existential interpretation on this. We wanted to emphasize the capacity we have for freedom, no matter the circumstances. So, look at Frankl and Mandela. I wanted to emphasize how freedom and responsibility are done increasing our corner of the world and making that difference. And how when we begin to pursue what's good or counsel other people to pursue what's good, we have to treat them as human agents with their own perceptions of the world, our own ways of dealing with the world, and motivate them based on their lives and where they're at, so that they see something that's good for them and not just a generic good. So that's week 4, video 2.